Picture this. You've been popping a magnesium pill every night for 3 weeks because you read somewhere that it helps with sleep. Or maybe your calves seize up at 2 in the morning. Or your chest has that fluttery, wired feeling that just won't quit, and nothing changes. So you quietly decide magnesium doesn't work for you. Before you give up on it, flip the bottle over and read the label one more time, because there's a very good chance the number printed there was never built to solve the problem you're trying to solve. Most bottles list somewhere between 320 and 420 milligrams per serving. That figure isn't random, but it also isn't aimed at fixing anxiety, insomnia, or muscle cramps. It comes from something called the RDA, the recommended dietary allowance, and almost nobody understands what that number was actually built for. Here's the real definition, the one straight from the nutrition boards that calculate it. It's the average daily intake sufficient to meet the nutrient needs of nearly all healthy individuals. Read that again. Healthy individuals. Not people with leg cramps at night. Not people staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. with their heart pounding. Not people who feel on edge for no clear reason. The RDA was built as a floor, a line drawn to keep an already healthy population from sliding into outright deficiency disease, the kind that eventually shows up as seizures or dangerous heart rhythms. It was never designed as a target for symptom relief, and it definitely wasn't designed with your particular nervous system in mind. It gets stranger when you look at where that number actually came from. The current magnesium RDA was set back in 1997, and the committee calculated it using reference body weights of roughly 133 pounds for women and 166 pounds for men. Take a second and think about whether those numbers still describe the average adult walking around today. Researchers have actually gone back and redone the math using current average body weights, and depending on which model they use, the corrected recommendation comes out anywhere from 60 to well over 200 milligrams higher than what's printed on your bottle. In other words, the official minimum was outdated almost the moment heavier, more stressed, more caffeinated modern humans started reading it. And that's still just the deficiency prevention number for a generic healthy person. It says nothing about what it actually takes to calm an anxious nervous system, loosen a clenched jaw, or quiet a brain that won't power down at night. When researchers have studied magnesium for things like high blood pressure, migraines, depression, and irregular heartbeats, the doses used in those trials often climbed into the 600 to 800 milligram range, sometimes sustained for weeks at a time, sometimes longer. One group of clinicians studying magnesium repletion stated outright that correcting an actual deficiency typically requires at least 600 milligrams daily, and that you shouldn't expect to see the full effect until you've stuck with it for a month or more. So when someone takes 350 milligrams for 2 weeks, feels nothing, and concludes the mineral is useless, that's a little like turning on a garden hose to fill a swimming pool and shutting it off 10 minutes later, then announcing the pool will never fill. The dose was a teaspoon where a steady stream was needed, and the timeline was a fraction of what was required. Now, here's where it gets worse, because dosage isn't even the only place people get tripped up. The form of magnesium matters just as much, maybe more. Walk down any supplement aisle, and the overwhelming majority of cheap magnesium products use something called magnesium oxide. It's easy to see why manufacturers love it. It's inexpensive to produce, and it packs a large amount of elemental magnesium into a tiny capsule, so a label can boast 400 milligrams without needing you to swallow a handful of pills. The catch is that magnesium oxide is poorly soluble, and poor solubility means poor absorption. Multiple studies estimate its absorption rate at somewhere around 4%, occasionally creeping up toward the low teens depending on the study. Do the arithmetic on that, and a 400 milligram tablet might hand your body somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 milligrams of usable magnesium. The rest sits in your gut, pulling water into your intestines, which is exactly why people who try to push through with oxide by taking more often end up running to the bathroom instead of sleeping better. This single detail also explains a lot of the confusing, mixed research you'll find if you go digging for magnesium studies online. A huge portion of the older clinical literature on magnesium used the oxide form, dosed conservatively because higher amounts triggered diarrhea, and absorbed at a trickle. It's no wonder some of those trials reported underwhelming results. They weren't testing whether magnesium works. They were testing whether a form of magnesium your gut barely lets through, given in amounts capped by its own laxative effect, works. Of course, the answer often came back lukewarm. If you're dealing with constipation, magnesium oxide actually has a legitimate, if narrow, use, since pulling water into the bowel is exactly what you want in that situation. But if your goal is calming your nervous system, easing muscle tension, or correcting a real deficiency, you want a chelated form instead, and magnesium glycinate is usually the one worth reaching for. It's bonded to the amino acid glycine, which allows it to be absorbed through a completely different pathway than oxide uses, one that doesn't carry the same osmotic, water-pulling baggage. Estimates of its absorption vary depending on the study, but it consistently outperforms oxide by a wide margin, and people tolerate it far better, with little to none of the gastrointestinal fallout. There's also a nice bonus built into the glycine itself. Glycine is calming in its own right and interacts with receptors that help quiet an overactive nervous system. So you're essentially getting a small assist toward relaxation layered on top of the magnesium. Which brings us to the part of this story most people have never heard, the part about what magnesium is actually doing inside your skull. Think of your brain as having an accelerator and a brake. The accelerator is a neurotransmitter called glutamate, and it's responsible for exciting your neurons, firing them up so you can focus intensely, react quickly, and think on your feet. That's a completely normal and necessary system. The brake is a different neurotransmitter called GABA, and its job is to calm those same neurons back down, to let your brain ease off the gas as bedtime approaches, and let you actually drift into deep, restorative sleep. Magnesium's role in this whole system is surprisingly direct. At the cellular level, certain receptors that respond to glutamate have a literal physical channel, and magnesium ions sit inside that channel, acting almost like a plug, blocking excess signal from flooding through and keeping the accelerator from getting stuck to the floor. When your magnesium stores run low, that plug isn't there in sufficient amounts, and the brake system loses some of its ability to counterbalance the accelerator. The result is a brain that idles hot, even while you're lying in bed with your eyes closed, technically resting, but never quite shutting down. Here's the part that trips a lot of people up. That overexcited, idling hot brain state feels almost identical to what high cortisol feels like. Anxiety, insomnia, especially the kind where you fall asleep fine but snap awake at 3 or 4 in the morning and can't get back under. Irritability, where tiny annoyances feel enormous. Racing thoughts you can't slow down. Cravings that seem to come out of nowhere. Calf cramps, foot cramps, that sudden Charlie horse that jolts you awake. Heart palpitations that sometimes edge into actual rhythm irregularities. Nearly every symptom on that list could be coming from a stress hormone problem, or it could be coming from a brain that's lost its ability to apply the brakes. And most people, understandably, assume it's the former. So they reach for ashwagandha or some other adaptogen marketed at lowering cortisol. And sometimes that genuinely helps. Other times, it barely moves the needle because the actual bottleneck was never cortisol in the first place. It was a nervous system that simply didn't have enough raw material to power down. So, how do you tell the difference? There are some useful clues. A cortisol-dominant picture tends to come with stubborn belly fat, elevated blood sugar, a surge of glucose first thing in the morning, known as the dawn phenomenon, an immune system that seems to catch every bug going around, and blood pressure that runs higher than it should. A glutamate-dominant picture looks different. Exhaustion that somehow coexists with an inability to actually fall or stay asleep, muscle twitches, a jaw that aches from clenching or grinding through the night, restless legs that won't settle, and a pattern where magnesium supplementation, if you take enough of it, produces a noticeable shift within hours rather than days. The cortisol-driven version tends to respond more slowly, sometimes taking several days of consistent magnesium before you notice a change, because you're working through a hormonal cascade rather than directly refilling a missing cofactor. The genuinely encouraging part is that both pictures usually trace back to the exact same root cause. not enough magnesium. And both pictures share the same frustrating trap, which is that taking the bare government minimum almost never moves either problem in a meaningful way. This isn't unique to magnesium, by the way. Plenty of nutrients carry RDA numbers that were calculated purely to prevent catastrophic deficiency, rather than to optimize how you actually feel, which is part of why so many people take a multivitamin for months and notice absolutely nothing. Body weight isn't the only thing pushing real-world need above the printed minimum either. Anything that increases how much magnesium your kidneys flush out or how much your cells burn through will widen the gap. Regular caffeine intake nudges urinary magnesium loss upward. A diet heavy in refined sugar does something similar, partly because processing glucose itself draws on magnesium as a cofactor. Alcohol does it. Certain common medications, including some diuretics and long-term acid reflux drugs, are well documented to deplete magnesium over time. Even a demanding training schedule counts, since intense exercise dramatically increases the body's magnesium turnover as muscles contract, repair, and produce energy. None of this shows up anywhere on the label of your supplement bottle, because the RDA was never built to account for any of it. It assumes a calm, well-fed, low-stress baseline that, if we're honest, describes a fairly small slice of the population. There's also a vicious cycle hiding inside all of this. Poor sleep raises cortisol. Elevated cortisol burns through magnesium faster. Lower magnesium means the brake system works less effectively, so the brain runs hotter, which makes sleep even harder to come by, which raises cortisol further. Round and round it goes, and the entire loop is being fed by a shortage of the one raw material that lets both systems power down. Now, here's something fascinating and honestly a little maddening about trying to figure out if you're actually deficient. A standard blood test is almost useless for catching it. Only about 1% of your total body magnesium floats around in your bloodstream at any given time. The vast majority lives inside your cells, your muscles, and your bones. Your body treats that 1% like a thermostat setting it desperately wants to protect. So if your overall stores start dropping, your bones will literally release some of their banked magnesium into the blood just to keep that number looking normal on paper. That means you can be meaningfully depleted at the tissue level while your standard blood panel comes back perfectly fine, and your doctor tells you everything looks normal. You might assume a red blood cell magnesium test solves this, since it at least looks past the blood plasma and into the cells themselves. It's a modest improvement, but it still has a major blind spot. Mature red blood cells don't contain mitochondria, the structures responsible for producing the bulk of your body's cellular energy. And a huge share of your body's functional magnesium is busy working inside mitochondria-rich tissue elsewhere, particularly in your brain, your heart, and your muscles. A red blood cell, lacking that machinery entirely, simply isn't a great window into what's happening in the tissues that actually burn through magnesium the fastest. There is a more rigorous way to check, called a magnesium loading or retention test, where you're given an infusion and then your urine is measured to see how much your body chooses to hang on to versus excrete. It's accurate, but it's involved enough that almost nobody bothers, including most doctors. In studies using muscle biopsies as the gold standard comparison, researchers have found that roughly half of patients with completely normal-looking blood magnesium were, in fact, depleted at the tissue level. Half. That's not a rounding error. That's a coin flip. And it means an enormous number of people walk out of a doctor's office having been told their magnesium is fine when it genuinely isn't. This is where a piece of forgotten medical history becomes worth knowing. Back in 1921, a physician named Weston published a report right in the very first issue of the American Journal of Psychiatry, describing what happened when he gave magnesium sulfate injections to 50 patients suffering from severe agitated depression. 220 out of 250 doses produced real improvement, patients relaxing enough to sleep for 4 to 6 hours when they hadn't been able to before. That's roughly a 90% success rate, recorded over a century ago in one of psychiatry's own founding journals, and then largely forgotten by the field that published it. Worth noting, those patients weren't getting a gentle 350 milligram capsule. The doses used ranged considerably higher, often between 500 and 1200 milligrams a day. Fast forward to today, and somewhere around 60% of depression cases get classified as treatment resistant, meaning the standard medications simply aren't doing the job. It's reasonable to wonder how many of those cases have a nutritional piece tangled up in them that nobody ever checked, especially when most medical visits don't screen for nutrient deficiencies at all, let alone treat them as clinically relevant. Part of why deficiency has become so common in the first place comes down to what's happened to our food supply. Industrial fertilizers loaded with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium are fantastic at producing large, attractive looking crops. But that same chemical cocktail tends to crowd out mineral uptake, including magnesium, leaving you with produce that looks perfectly healthy on a grocery shelf while being comparatively hollow on the inside. Layer on top of that the everyday realities of modern living: chronic stress, regular caffeine, a diet leaning on sugar and processed food, and intense exercise, all of which actively burn through magnesium faster than a typical diet replenishes it. It's a near perfect setup for widespread, invisible depletion. So, what's the actual fix? Start with the right form, magnesium glycinate, rather than the cheap oxide version sitting on most pharmacy shelves. If your goal is genuine symptom relief rather than just dodging outright deficiency, don't settle for one 350 milligram dose and call it done. Many people find better results splitting their intake into smaller amounts taken 2 or 3 times across the day, which can land you anywhere from several hundred milligrams up toward the 800 to 1200 range used in some of the higher dose clinical research, depending on what you're trying to address, and always worth discussing with a doctor first, especially if you have kidney issues or take other medications. Taking it with a meal can ease any mild stomach upset, and a dose in the evening tends to make the most sense for sleep-related goals, since that's exactly when you want the brake system fully online. If your stomach handles glycinate without any issue, and you'd still like a touch of gentle bowel support on the side, magnesium citrate is a reasonable middle ground between oxide and glycinate, though it won't match glycinate's absorption or its calming profile. And give it real time. If your pattern looks more like the overactive, brain won't shut off picture, you may genuinely feel a shift within hours of bumping your intake up. If it looks more cortisol driven, expect to give it several days to a couple of weeks before judging whether it's working, and don't expect the full effect to show up before the 30-day mark. Treat the first month as a genuine trial rather than a quick experiment, the same way you treat starting a new exercise routine or changing your diet, because a single rushed week was never going to be enough to refill stores that likely took years to run low. Magnesium isn't a miracle, and it isn't the answer to every sleepless night or every anxious thought. But it's strange how often a mineral this cheap, this overlooked, and this poorly dosed turns out to be sitting underneath problems people have spent years and a small fortune trying to solve in far more complicated ways. Check the form you're taking. Check the dose you're actually getting absorbed rather than the number printed on the label, and give your body the time it actually needs to respond. Sometimes the fix really is that unglamorous.